His legacy is eternal. His feats endure through history. His campaigns laid the foundations of medieval Europe. He restored the Roman Empire and expanded Christianity among the pagan peoples. His name is Charlemagne. In the year 768 of our Lord, King Pepin died and Charlemagne and his brother split in two. The kingdom of the Franks, Charlemagne would rule the north and west coast, while Carloman would rule the interior of the kingdom and the south coast. Charlemagne would not face his brother, so all his efforts would be focused on improving his part of the kingdom. The first target was Aquitaine. Pepin had already launched a victorious expedition against the rebels who had taken up arms in these lands, but now they had rebelled again. Onaldo rebelled in an attempt to declare Aquitaine's independence from Charlemagne. Fu would not allow it. He gathered his troops and asked for help from his brother Carloman. Was he sure that a campaign together would unite both kingdoms and prevent future conflicts? They met in Moncontour, but there Carloman refused to help him with troops or supplies, and as soon as he arrived, he returned to his kingdom. Charlemagne was perplexed, but he could do nothing about it. He marched with his men to the south, and little by little, the town surrendered without fighting. They had been deceived by Onaldo to take up arms against the Franks. News came that Onaldo had fled further south to where the Gascons were located. Charlemagne sent an ambassador to this people, inviting them to surrender to him to accept his authority. The Gascons accepted without hesitation and handed over Onaldo to the Frankish king. Britannia had been pacified. But then in the year 771, Charlemagne died, and the Franks of those lands named Charlemagne king, so he became the only king of all the Franks. But his sister-in-law and her children disagreed. Carloman's widow took her children, and they all fled together to the Lombard kingdom, led by Desiderius. Obviously, this angered Charlemagne, but he did not respond in any way. What he did do was inform the Pope that he was preparing a campaign to convert the Saxons to Christianity. First, he would use diplomacy and missionaries. But if this strategy failed, what had he been doing for a while now? Weapons.
Would the Frankish weapons speak?
And while this was happening, there were political military movements in Italy.
Pope Adrian
requested Desiderio, whom I just mentioned, to return lands to the Papal States. Of course, the Lombards, upon hearing this request, scoffed and decided to respond. Desiderio gathered his army and marched south, taking territory from the Papal States in response and laying siege to the city of Rome itself. Pope Adrian, fearful of losing all his possessions, requested help from Charlemagne so that, just like his father had done, he would support the Catholic Church. Charlemagne accepted the challenge. He sent a message to the Lombard king requesting the return of the territories conquered from the Catholic Church, as well as the surrender of those territories that Pope Adrian was requesting. In addition, he ordered the immediate cessation of Lombard hostilities against the Catholic Church. Desiderius refused to sign such a proposal, as it was an affront to his people. Charlemagne already had a decent casus belli, but of course Charlemagne already had the campaign against the Saxons ready. So he decided that he would first take care of these and then march to Italy to put the Lombards in their place. Before launching the campaign, I should note that the Saxons were divided into four major groups. Westphalia, which was the western part, Eastphalia, which was the eastern part, and in between we have Nordalbingia in the north and Angria in the south. It's not that they were culturally very different. It was really a classification based on their origin. And now the Frankish monarch decided to launch his campaign. Charlemagne set out with his army from the Rhine, with the city of Eresburg as his first target. An interesting fact is that the Frankish army had a large number of bishops and monks, showing that their intention was to convert the population to the Holy Faith. They arrived at Eresburg and After a brief siege, the city fell into Frankish hands. From there, Charlemagne dedicated himself to destroying the Saxon defenses of those cities in the area that were captured. In this way, they advanced like a steamroller until they reached the Weser River. Once there, he proposed peace to the Saxons and they accepted it.
Accepted it. Handing over.
Hostages as a sign that they do not cower in arms in the territories that were now in the possession of the Franks. In the spring of the year 773, Charlemagne gathered his army again and set course for Italy. He probably knew that despite having Saxon hostages, they would likely rebel. For faith is very powerful. But he had to solve the problems in Italy. It was very convenient for him to get along with the Pope. But he no longer only intended to stop the disputes between the Lombards and the Pope, right? Now his goal was to conquer the entire Lombard kingdom. His army crossed the Alps just like Hannibal did centuries ago, and entered Italy as soon as they descended from the Alps. The Franks encountered the Lombard army, led by Desiderius himself entrenched in Susa. The size of each of the armies is not known, but it is known that the Franks formed in battle order and charged against the Lombards. The latter could not resist the enemy onslaught and broke ranks. Desiderio ordered a general retreat, dividing his army in two. He would go to Pavia, where he entrenched himself, while another part of the army, led by his son Adalgis, did the same. But in Verona, Charlemagne, with hardly any troops bombarding nearby, was taking one by one the Italian cities closest to the territory of the Franks. And finally, in September of the year 773, it was Pavia's turn. He laid siege to the city, preparing for a long siege. As the enemy monarch had been able to bring supplies to the city, he left a part of the army besieging the city and departed with the rest to take the surroundings. He headed to Verona, aware that there was a large number of Lombard troops led by the prince, so they had to be besieged and prevented from moving. However, Adalgis abandoned the city and his men upon learning of Charlemagne's approach and fled to Constantinople. The Lombards, seeing that their own prince had abandoned them, opened the gates and surrendered the city. Meanwhile, Desiderio stood firm, still trusting that his dukes and counts would be gathering an army to save their beloved king. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Lombard nobility had thrown in the towel, and they can be partly blamed for being traitors. But can it also be understood that the population was tired of so many wars and didn't mind submitting to another dominant force? It must be taken into account that in the last 300 years, Italy has been in the hands of the Western Roman Empire, in the hands of Odoacer, then in Ostrogothic hands, then the Eastern Roman Empire, then the Lombards, and now the Franks. Therefore, in the year 774, Desiderius laid down his arms and opened the city gates, surrendering not only Pavia, but the entire Lombard kingdom. At that moment, Charlemagne assumed the title of King of the Lombards, thus becoming Charlemagne, King of the Franks and Lombards. He returned to the Pope the territories that the Lombards had snatched from him, and also handed over those that the papacy claimed. With that, he was in good terms with the Catholic Church, something very, very important that would help Charlemagne in his future. But while this was happening, the Saxons rebelled. They attacked the city of Eresburg and reconquered it. They did the same with the city of Sigurgo, but failed in their attempt to take Küraberg. Taking advantage of the Frankish army being in the south, the Saxons launched raids against the Franks, even going so far as to loot and burn churches and abbeys, as well as murder their monks. The news reached the ears of Charlemagne, and without hardly any rest. In January of the year 775, the Frankish monarch gathered his army and decided to head north. But we'll leave this for the next video. In the year 776, Charlemagne had just defeated the Lombards and was preparing to subdue the Saxons again, when a Muslim embassy arrived, led by the governor of Barcelona, Suleiman, who had risen up in arms against the emir of Cordoba, who was Umayyad, while Suleiman detested the Umayyads and supported the Abbasids. They offered Suleiman a deal he couldn't refuse. He would hand over some strongholds in the northeast of the peninsula, the main one being Zaragoza, in exchange for the Franks helping him defeat the emir and allowing them to be independent and favorable to the caliph. Charlemagne could only benefit from this agreement. The Muslims had already invaded his domains twice, and although they had been defeated on both occasions, like in the Battle of Tours, which I leave for you up here, was he sure that the Muslims would try again? He had to take the war to the other side of the Pyrenees. He accepted the deal and began to prepare a large conquest army. He established 2 different armies. One column would cross the Pyrenees from the east, while the other, led by him in person and accompanied by Suleiman, would do so from the west, through the pass of Roncesvalles. In the spring of the year 778, with the snows already melted, the Franks began the march. They crossed the Pyrenees without major problems and without encountering resistance, which was to be expected, as presumably the Muslims in that area were favorable to them. When Charlemagne arrived in Pamplona, he decided to destroy the walls. Why? In case something went wrong. If the city walls were intact, they could harbor a large Muslim host that would tie them up all the way back. Without walls, that danger partially disappeared. He left a small contingent in the city and continued his way to Zaragoza, the first city that would be handed over to him without opposition. There he met the other column, but when they went to enter the city, its gates closed. It turns out that the city's governor had been overthrown by a coup d'etat, and now in command was Hussein al-Ansari, also hostile to the Umayyads, but at that moment, he preferred to position himself against Suleiman and Charlemagne. Yes, seriously. The Frankish monarch now found himself at a crossroads. The siege of Zaragoza would be very, very long, and although he had more than enough men to take the city, what he didn't have was supplies. He also couldn't go taking other cities, as he would lose men and could be defeated by a reinforcing Muslim force. The same would happen if he sent out raiding parties. These could be attacked, and his army would gradually be depleted. A supply line from this Frankish territory was unthinkable, as it would be very dangerous, and when winter came, it would be impracticable. He could use Pamplona as a base of operations, but without walls, he could not defend it against a large enemy army, and if he was defeated, the escape would be chaotic, even more so if it was in autumn or winter. The best thing was to retreat. Charlemagne accepted that he had failed and would retreat to Frankish territory. He would see what he would do the following year. He took Suleiman as a hostage to keep the Muslim people at bay, and headed west to the pass of Roncesvalles, through which he had arrived. On the way to the pass, it is possible that Charlemagne handed over Suleiman to his sons in an attempt to secure a safe return, or that the sons rescued him. The fact is that Charlemagne was left without Suleiman as a life insurance. The Franks, moreover, were looting all the towns in their path, taking food, gold, and jewels as spoils of their campaign. From Pamplona, the Franks were watched by growing columns of Muslims, a mix of warriors and armed peasants. Finally, the Franks arrived at the entrance of the pass through the Pyrenees, which would take them back to their kingdom. He arranged a long column with the baggage train in the rear, protected by foot troops distributed among the wagons and cavalry behind. With this arrangement, his hordes began to penetrate. Through the gorge, groups of armed troops lay on the heights of the gorge, in the area between Roncesvalles and Balterlos. The exact point is not clear. The fact is that as the baggage train took slopes on the road, It was falling behind the rest of the column, also slowing down the heavy cavalry that was coming behind. With the fall of night, when it was already difficult for the baggage train to be seen by the rest of the Frank column, the ambushers launched their attack.
Who attacked?
There are several hypotheses. They could have been Basques, Muslims, or Africans. I will refer to them as ambushers, so as not to favor any of the three hypotheses. A rain of javelins and arrows fell. Surprise on the Franks, who, not expecting such an attack, suffered numerous casualties. To prevent those ambushed from being able to flee forward or backward, the attackers sent a party of warriors to block the road on both sides. So if the Franks wanted to escape, they would have to fight hand to hand. The projectiles kept falling, and Roland, commander of the rear guard, blew his ivory horn to alert Charlemagne of what was happening. However, Charlemagne, far from the point of the battle, surrounded by the neighing of horses, the sound of the wind among the mountains, and the noise of thousands of men marching, he didn't hear the distress call. The rear guard was alone. Roland knew they were lost. His heavy cavalry, fearsome in open field, was useless in the pass. The arrows kept falling, and his men were dying. He had no archers to respond to the fire, so he could only trust in sheltering each other under their shields to avoid being hit. Roland ordered his cavalry to dismount and fight on foot, to be a much smaller target and to more easily repel any enemy attack. And indeed, it did not wait. When the Franks had already been worn down by the projectiles, the attackers drew their weapons and charged downhill against the Franks. The charge itself was already a wreck. The speed of the ambushers charging downhill caused the Franks to have gaps along the entire column. However, the quality of the Franks was far superior, as that army had been fighting for many years, either among themselves against the Muslims, against the Lombards, or the Ossiones, so they were experienced warriors. In addition, their equipment quality was better. But of course, ambushed without space to form a shield wall and attacked from both sides, it was impossible for them to hold out. Little by little, the ambushers were gaining ground, until there came a point where the Franks were fighting back to back, huddled together. In the center of the gorge, Charles the Great's column kept marching, without knowing what was happening behind them. Although there was little they could have done, as probably the number of targets to shoot at from the top of the slopes had increased. Finally, the last of the Franks fell, leaving the gorge carpeted with dead from both sides, including Roland himself. The attackers, if they had wanted to, could have repeated the same operation with another part of the Frankish column. That is, if their goal was to finish off the Frankish army. But what they did was something else. The ambushers dedicated themselves to looting the baggage train, recovering all the loot that the Franks had snatched from them and intended to take to France. As Charlemagne's army emerged on the far side of the Pyrenees, he pined tea. After waiting several hours for the baggage train, he understood that it would never leave, that something had happened to it. But the worst part was having lost the heavy cavalry of the rear guard. Although numerically the defeat had not been very serious, it had indeed had a huge political cost. For what seemed to be a simple walk to Zaragoza to take the square had turned into a flight in which he had lost all the loot, and the heavy cavalry in the rear. The balance was completely negative. Charlemagne decided to return to Saxony, where the Saxons would cause problems again. But of course he was certain that Al-Andalus was a prize too good not to try to take it again. The Franks would soon be back. Year 775 after Christ. Charlemagne had just subdued the Lombards in northern Italy, and after the revolt in Saxony, he had to rush to this territory to punish the rebels. If you haven't seen the Conquest of Lombardy by Charlemagne, I'll leave the video for you above. The punitive expedition was quick. First he took Siburgo, rebuilt the defenses, left a garrison, and quickly departed to Eresburgo, where he did the same. With both cities secured, he marched with his host to the east to the Bezer River, where a large Saxon army had decided to make a stand. A battle took place by the river Rio, which the Franks had to cross to face the enemy, but they did, and they emerged victorious. With the Saxon army destroyed, they continued to the fort of Sigiburgo and conquered it. At that moment, Charlemagne decided that he needed to speed up the conquest process, and for that he divided his army in two. He sent one part to clear the entire Esbisi Valley, while he personally commanded the other half, against the Eastphalians under their leader Esi. It doesn't seem like there was much resistance in this area, so more or less quickly, the territory was conquered by the imperial forces. With Westphalia subdued, Charlemagne headed southwest where Angria was located. The Angrians were led by Brune, and again after seeing the Frankish might, Angria submitted to the power of Charlemagne. The conquest seemed to be going smoothly. Once Westphalia, Eastphalia, and Angria were subdued, they had to go for the last territory. Do you remember which one it was? Yes, Nordalbingia? But he couldn't go, because the Westphalian Saxons seemed not to be completely subdued, and they rose up in arms. Led by Widukind, remember this name, the Saxon leader faced Charlemagne in open field, but he was defeated and his army was routed. To avoid being captured, Widukind escaped to the north. Winter was approaching, but moreover, he received news that the Lombards were causing trouble. Even though it's not about the conquest of Saxony, I'm going to tell you about this little rebellion because it's short. The Lombard dukes Friuli and Spoleto rebelled against the Carolingian power. It's possible, though not certain, that they were financially supported by the Avars. The fact is that Charlemagne crossed the Alps and confronted the rebel forces. In a short time, the enemies were defeated and their cities were recaptured. It seemed that for a while northern Italy would be at peace, but it was not so. Saxony, in the year 776, Charlemagne had to return to the north because the Saxons had rebelled again. They had not taken but destroyed the fortress of Eresburg. Again led by Widukind, Charlemagne entered Saxony in full force through Worms. The Saxon leaders, caught off guard, surrendered and converted to Christianity. Charlemagne restored Eresburg and built a fortress in Carlsberg. However, the most important Saxon leader, Widukind, fled to present-day Denmark, where he began to prepare a new uprising. In 778, Charlemagne left to fight on another front. Do you know which one? Okay, correct. The invasion of the Emirate of Cordoba and the subsequent Battle of Roncesvalles. I'll leave the video here in case you missed it. The fact is that his absence allowed the Saxons to cause new problems. This led to, in the year 782, Charlemagne assembling an army whose goal would be to defeat a new army. Saxon, led again by Widukind, who had returned to Saxony from Denmark. The Saxon gathered his hosts in the Sumtel Mountains, from where he could control the Besser River. There he built a fortified camp where he intended to defeat the Frankish troops. The position of the Saxons was very good. 3 of the 4 sides of the camp were protected by steep slopes, so the Franks could only attack from one point. The Frankish army, which was in Eresburg, had about 3,000 warriors, while the rebels were about 4,500. Charlemagne did not lead the army in person, but it was led by 4 commanders. We will see what happened. The Frankish cavalry was led by 3 veteran generals, who wanted to take the glory and not share it with the 4th commander who led the infantry. What did they do? Well, the Frankish cavalry, in a suicidal act, left the infantry behind, advanced and charged disorganized against the Saxons. They were torn apart. The Saxons were able to hold their position thanks to their heavy spears and the cover of their archers, and they wiped out most of the cavalry. Carolingian Theodoric, commander of the infantry, upon learning of this disaster, ordered the retreat. Charlemagne, who was in Bavaria when he received the news, left with his own army to Saxony without the need to fight. The Saxons, they surrendered again, and Widukind fled to Denmark again. The Frankish king decided to give an exemplary punishment to the Saxons. He summoned the Saxons who had participated in the rebellion and gathered them in Verdun. There he ordered the beheading of 4,500 Saxons in what is known as the Massacre of Verdun. Charlemagne needed to show Europe that if anyone challenged him, they would be severely punished. It was something detestable, but the king considered it necessary. In addition, he banned pagan religions, severely punishing those who did not practice Christianity. Let's remember that his casus belli, at least the official one, was that he had to convert the Saxons to Catholicism. Well, with these laws, he took a step in that direction. In the year 784, Charlemagne marched again with an army to Saxony and set fire to the villages that did not accept his sovereignty or did not submit to Christianity. Finally, in the year 785, Widukind agreed to surrender and be baptized in exchange for Charlemagne, ceasing his devastation. The Saxon lands from this moment on, Saxony will see widespread peace, although there will be various uprisings by the Saxons, although it is true that they will no longer be as important as the previous ones. It was probably during these rebellions that the last Saxon territory, more or less independent Nordalbingia, came under Frankish rule. And it was also this last territory that led the last of the Saxon rebellions, which took place in the year 804. The Frankish king defeated the rebels, subdued them, and to guarantee future peace, Charlemagne deported about 10,000 people from those lands to other territories under Frankish rule. The Saxon Wars had ended after about 30 years of almost continuous rebellions and military campaigns. On the other hand, in the more administrative, political, and religious aspect, Charlemagne decided to repeal the laws that had been so harsh. Like with paganism, basically. He eliminated the harshest punishments for practicing religions other than Christianity. But he made sure that all the Saxon territory was filled with ecclesiastical structures, that is, churches, chapels, preachers, everywhere. The idea was that now that they were physically subdued, the church would fight in the spiritual realm against paganism. And now that the Saxon Wars are over, what did Charlemagne do? Well, it turns out that while the Saxon Wars were taking place, Charlemagne led campaigns against the Avars and the Slavs, so the next chapter in Charlemagne's life will be about one of these wars. In the year 787, Charlemagne decided that he would annex Bavaria, the last independent duchy of France, and for this he summoned the Duke of Bavaria with the intention that he would swear fealty. The Duke refused and sought the help of the Avars to avoid the subjugation of his domains. The Avar hosts gathered near Lens, but they did not cross the river. They waited to see how the war would evolve. Charlemagne, for his part, gathered his hosts and invaded Bavaria, with resounding success, and the duchy was annexed to France. The Avars responded to the threat by launching two simultaneous attacks against the Franks, one against the territories north of Italy, and another across the Danube. The Avars managed to loot and obtain booty, but were expelled by the imperial troops. The Avar Khagan tried to make peace with Charlemagne, but he was aware of his chances to subdue this people. With the Saxons almost subdued, whose war you can see in the link you have above, he could concentrate all his forces on that project. And I take this opportunity to ask you to subscribe if you like my content, and consider joining the channel's Patreon to access exclusive content, like the second part of the Julius Caesar series and access to new videos before their publication. I continue. Both peoples began to concentrate their respective armies, the Avars along with Lens and Charlemagne, in Regensburg. The Frankish army was a mix of Saxons, Frisians, Franks, Thuringians, Alemanni, and Bavarians. The Avars, for their part, entrusted their defense to a series of strategically distributed fortresses along the border. These fortresses are curious and are known as Avar rings. They consisted of a series of concentric walls, with vegetation on top of them and the doors not aligned with each other, so that any attacking army would have to overcome the defenses at great cost. And the idea was for Charlemagne to wear himself out attacking these fortresses, because if he didn't, his supply lines would be exposed to Avar attacks originating from these rings. The first invasion campaign began in the year 791. The strategy consisted of launching 3 columns from different directions. One, under the command of Theodoric, marched along the north bank of the Danube. The second, under the command of Charlemagne, marched along the south bank of the same river. And the third and final one, led by his son Pepin, marched from Italy. The Avars, as I just mentioned, entrusted the defense to their border forts, and to deny the Franks any possible resource, they employed the scorched earth strategy, ravaging their own fields and villages while withdrawing the army to avoid a pitched battle against the Carolingian monarch and his hosts. While Charlemagne and Theodoric took the border forts in the northwest, Pepin ventured into Avar territory and came across an enemy army. The battle didn't last long, and the Franks achieved their first victory on enemy territory. When the news reached Charlemagne, he ordered his column and Theodoric's to advance and penetrate into Avar territory. They reached the Raba River, but then there was a dramatic turn of events. An intense equine epidemic spread by mosquitoes broke out. The result, 90% of the Frankish horses died. And, of course, most of their army was cavalry, so suddenly they were disarmed. The Frankish monarch had no other choice. He ordered the retreat, fearful that the Sarmatians, also with a mounted army, would pursue and decimate them. But this did not happen, because the Sarmatians also lost most of their mounts. The campaign had lasted only 52 days. Charlemagne settled in Bavaria and immediately began preparing a campaign against the Sarmatians, which would not be launched until years later. And I ask you, what did Charlemagne try to build in the year 793? Leave me your answer in the comments and we'll see if you've got it right. Now let's continue and jump to the year 795. The Avar Khanate crumbled. There was a series of disputes among the different families, leading to the death of Khan himself and even an Avar leader named Tudun. He swore fealty to Charlemagne and switched sides to the Franks. That same year, Erich Duke of Friuli decided to take advantage of the Avar divinity and on behalf of Charlemagne invaded the Khanate. Although he did not lead the army, he appointed the Slav Boimir as commander of his forces while he stayed in his duchy. The military campaign was relatively straightforward due to the internal conflicts the Avars were having. The Duke was able to take various Avar rings, seizing the succulent treasures they kept in the inner ring. In addition, he was able to take various villages and obtained a large number of prisoners. It is worth noting that he managed to capture and loot the Khan's capital fortress, whose exact location is unknown. It is only known that it was between the Danube and Tisa rivers. He also got a good handful of horses that would help replace all the mounts lost during the first invasion campaign. Well, to these and those he lost during the terrible ambush he suffered in Roncesvalles, after trying to take the city of Zaragoza. Here above, I leave you the link to the video in case you haven't seen it. The Duke's army returned to Friuli, and Eric handed over all the loot to Charlemagne. And he gave part of it to the Pope to further improve his relations with the Church. You will see that these diplomatic actions will bear fruit years later. And the following year, in 796, the death blow was dealt to the Avars. Pepin, son of Charlemagne, assembled an army to invade Avar territory again. It would be the last great campaign against the Cognate. Charlemagne sent Bavarians, Franks, and Aramaeans to his son as reinforcements through the Alps. The Duke of Friuli, Eric, also chose to back the invasion and sent troops to Pepin for his upcoming campaign. With everything ready, Pepin kicked off his conquest. Pepin led his men and began to check the lands closest to Lombardy. But then an emissary from the Khan himself arrived, offering to surrender to the Franks and swear fealty. Pepin relayed the message to Charlemagne, and he accepted the enemy's surrender. However, a portion of the Avars refused to surrender and fled to the east. The territory up to the Danube was conquered. For their part, the Bulgarians conquered the Avar territory. From the Carpathians to the Tisa River, the Avar Khanate disappeared. Pepin ordered the sending of clerics to the newly conquered territory. For what? To convert the inhabitants to Catholicism. Let's remember that this was one of the war cases that Charlemagne had used against the Saxons. To the east of the Enns River, the Avar March was established, which was a kind of safety cushion that the Franks would have against external threats. The military command of the march fell on 3 people, one of whom was Eric, the Duke of Friuli, whom we met a few minutes ago. In the year 800 of our era, specifically on December 25th, Charlemagne was crowned by Pope Leo III, Emperor of the Romans. In this way, the figure of Charlemagne was seen as the heir to the Roman Empire. With this title, Charlemagne could have claimed the Byzantine Empire. But to avoid problems and a surely very bloody war, he dismissed this possibility, at least for now. There are some historians who mark this moment as the origin of the Holy Roman Empire, but most simply dismiss it. It could have been the seed, but the Holy Empire would not see its birth until many years later. The now Carolingian Empire was a great power that rivaled with any opponent in the known world.